You are listening to Exploring Clean Energy, where we uncover the ideas, innovations and projects powering our sustainable future. I'm Andy Marsland. Welcome to the show. I'm thrilled to welcome our guest today, Hannah Monaghan. Hannah is the Australian lead of Global Sustainability Reporting and Governance for Boeing. So a very warm welcome to the Exploring Clean Energy podcast, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
So I expect most, if not all of the audience will know about Boeing in some fashion, but perhaps we can start at the top if you can give everyone an overview of Boeing as a company.
Yeah, I think that you're right. A lot of people do know about Boeing, and I think people think about, big 747s and those exciting things that take us around the world. I think that there is, people don't know a lot about Boeing in Australia necessarily, but we've been in Australia for over 98 years now. We're coming up on our 100-year anniversary, which is very exciting. We've got over 4,500 employees across Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. And we do everything in Australia. We have a commercial manufacturing suite in Melbourne, which makes commercial plane parts that go straight from Melbourne to Seattle. If you're ever flying on a 737 and you look out the window and see a winglet or something moving on a 737 wing, it probably came out of the Melbourne factory, which is really cool. And then we also, most of what we do in Australia, though, is defence sustainment. So we keep more than half of the Royal Australian Air Force's fleet in the sky, and other things like communication systems and military helicopters and all of that. We also operate a lot of research and technology in Australia and a lot of research with universities. So yeah, we do everything in Australia and we're really proud of it. We're one of Boeing's biggest footprints outside of the US and certainly one of the oldest.
I've got the feeling there could be a lot for us to get into.
Absolutely. There's a lot of directions we could go
It could be a long podcast.
That's okay.
Yeah, so from there, what does decarbonisation mean for Boeing globally? And I guess, from there, can we have a discussion about Boeing's pillars on that? And then how does that apply to the Australian sector?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the context of aviation as well when we talk about why decarbonisation is so important for Boeing. And globally, and this is certainly reflected in the Australian context as well, aviation represents about 2% of global emissions. And in the Australian context, air traffic is about 2% of our emissions as well. And 2% doesn't sound like a lot, especially not when we're talking about such massive volumes of emissions in the world. But the thing that is a challenge in this space is that air traffic is one of the only sectors, or aviation is one of the only sectors in Australia at least, where the emissions are forecast to grow, because we know that demand for aviation and air traffic will continue over time. This is particularly true in kind of the Asia Pacific region, where our own commercial market outlook has air traffic and air demand growing by over 7% up to 2050. And that's one of the strongest areas of growth in the world. There are a lot of things that are driving that, but if we are going to continue to grow at this pace, our emissions will continue to grow, and suddenly we're not 2% of the pie, we're much bigger. So it's on us to do whatever we can to bring that number down. Decarbonisation is our social license to grow in a resilient way. We know that, and I think that our approach reflects that we are going to throw everything at this problem, and depending on the context and the market and a regional policy or a domestic policy, you'll see kind of a different focus for where Boeing might be putting investment or might be putting all of our efforts.
Yeah, big challenge ahead then. So how are you separating that down into manageable pieces then?
I think that's a really good point as well, because this is a truly cross-industry effort. Aviation was one of the first industries in the world to adopt a net zero by 2050 goal, and it's one that's shared across every kind of pillar of aviation. It's not just OEMs and who are building aircraft, but people who are building engines and airports and operators and everyone kind of involved along the chain. So that's the lens through which we have to see the challenge, right? It's a huge global challenge, but how can we approach it in both domestic and regional contexts? And this is where Boeing's taken this pillar approach where we can tailor kind of solutions either to a region or to contribute to a global goal. And so the first one is fleet renewal. So every new generation of aircraft that comes into service can represent a 10 to 20% savings on fuel and emissions, which is incredible. But the other thing to remember about that is that our aircraft have a really long shelf life. So customers can't just keep renewing aircraft all the time just to meet their decarbonisation goals. But it's a really good start.
What's the typical shelf life of a
typical shelf life of an aircraft is anywhere sort of between 10 to 40 years in service. And often what you'll find is some customers who operate multiple fleets or kind of have different commercial setups, might have passengers on aircraft for 10 to 20 years and then convert that plane into a cargo plane as well. So they can have really significant shelf lives. And there are a lot of things that we can do along the way to improve decarbonisation outcomes on an older aircraft as well. So as part of our advanced technology and operational efficiency pillars, which we'll get into in a second, but there are things that you can do. So on a 737, for example, we can install something known as a winglet, which is like a split winglet that sits on the end of a 737, and suddenly that represents a fuel savings as well, because it changes the aerodynamics just enough that you can suddenly save a ton of fuel. Or tons, probably not exactly a specific term, but a significant amount of fuel, a lot of fuel. So there are things that we can do with an older aircraft too, which are really helpful, because I think every gallon, every litre of fuel and every kilo of CO2 counts. But yeah, with that fleet renewal piece, there are a lot of challenges in fleet renewal. It's not just about putting a new aircraft out into the market, but I think that's a really good starting point for customers who are along their decarbonisation journey for sure.
Yeah, just digging into that. So the end of the winglet, what advantage does that give? Is that more lift, or does it create or reduce turbulence at the end of the wing that you get more efficiencies from?
You're testing the limits of my knowledge, but it is in relation to the contrail as well. So it's how when you kind of see those images of air spiraling out the end of a wing, that's where you should be thinking. So again, around lift and turbulence.
Yes.
And it's really cool. And you'll notice on some of our other aircraft, they all have slightly different wing designs depending on the aircraft because of how much lift you need and things like that. A 787 has got these like beautiful curved wings that look like the wing of a bird almost, and have got that natural shape, and they bend really significantly. And on our new 777X, which should be coming into service soon and is undergoing testing at the moment, they have these really cool folding wingtips that come in. So when you're at an airport, you can just flip the wing in and then you fit in a regular aircraft bay, and you don't need one of those big giant gates that you might see for a 747 or a 777 or an A380.
Oh, wow. When are they coming in?
They're currently undergoing certification. I think we're hoping for a 2026 timeline at this point, but you can catch some of the certification test flights that are currently going on in the US at the moment.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so if you're really into watching tests
on a tangent,
it's impossible when you're talking about aviation not to, right? But when, we're testing them. I saw one of our Instagram posts this morning talking about we're testing new tyres on them and how many times you can land the plane before you have to replace the tyres. So there is so much that goes into certification, especially around new technologies and new craft, which is part of the challenge of fleet renewal and some of these other advanced technologies. Is it takes a really significant amount of time, and it absolutely should, to test that these new technologies work and to make sure that they're safe. When you're suddenly putting people in the sky, the standards against which you're testing safety are way more significant than anything you might imagine. And that, that's part of like the advanced technology challenge. So one of the other pillars that we describe is as advanced technology. So it's things like improving the life cycle of an aircraft, or testing out new propulsion systems, or we have a program called X66, which I'm a big fan of because I'm a massive Star Wars dork, and we call it the X-Wing. So the X66 is a truss brace wing that we're making with NASA, and no one's ever made a wing like this before, and it's currently going through wind tunnel testing. But to get a new kind of wing on an aircraft isn't just a genius engineer coming up with a new design. It's years of collaboration with agencies like NASA and testing and certification with the FAA. And then it's things like getting customers on board and making sure the public feels safe enough to fly in it. And it's a really significant process. But those are kind of the things that we're toying with in advanced technology and testing as we speak. So advanced technology is one thing, fleet renewal is another. Renewable energy is obviously the big one, and I'll come back to it. But the other thing that we are really focused on as well for our customers especially is operational efficiency. So we know that we can squeeze another 1 or 2% out of fuel use just on operational efficiency. And that's things like designing better flight routes for certain airports so you spend less time trying to come into land, or single engine taxiing so that you're only using one engine while you're taxiing on the runway for a long time rather than two.
Yes.
And then suddenly your fuel use drops down. And there's a lot of really significant modelling, and that's a that is something that we have to do in partnership with airlines and airports and civil aviation authorities, because when you're suddenly designing these new flight plans that see people land in one go rather than circling the airport 3 times, that's a fuel saving, but it also changes the way an airport might operate. So that's something that I think we shouldn't forget about, and something that can represent a really significant change. And the other thing that we talk about a lot is market-based measures. So we are a participant in CORSIA, which is a long acronym for the carbon offsetting, removal and the International Aviation Scheme that's designed under ICAO, and which is the UN agency for aviation. And that is where SAF comes into play, and we start to talk about things like sustainable aviation fuel, but also for offsetting and scope 3 and all those really nasty challenges, those really vexed and wicked problems that kind of sit at the end. But the other thing that we've shifted a lot of our attention to over the last little while is that R in CORSIA, which is removals. So carbon removals is a really exciting space for us. And actually, this week we just made our first announcement that we are entering into an MOU with an organisation called Aquatic, which is an ocean-based carbon removals company. And part of their program is that you actually get green hydrogen out of the process as one of the byproducts of their carbon removal plan. So it's a really interesting and exciting space. And we are shifting some of our attention from offsets into removals because we see a lot of potential there for sure.
Is that removals at source, like as they're coming out the engine, or is that air capture?
Not at source. It's air capture, direct air capture.
Yeah.
At source, it's something I get asked about a lot, and I think that there's definitely potential there. And I think that there's probably a lot more work that needs to be done there. People think about, you can't just kind of, how does it work to just stick something on the end of an aircraft to capture it? And then, it gets really complicated, right? And I'm not an engineer, but I imagine there's a lot of challenges involved in doing something like that. So then, having said all of that, the thing that we're really focused on, particularly in Australia and in the region, is this renewable energy piece. And for us, that means sustainable aviation fuel. Sustainable aviation fuel is a drop-in technology. So we know it works. We can use it now, and our customers certainly do, and we use it too where we can in terms of flight testing and deliveries and things like that. But it is, in most instances, a bio-based Jet A1 is the phrase, replacement fuel, that is ASTM certified. So it's gone through all the certifications that it needs to, and we can fly aircraft on it. And every single day around the world, aircraft are flying on blends of sustainable aviation fuel and traditional jet fuel.
So that's now currently?
Absolutely. It is now currently. We started testing sustainable aviation fuel in 2008. We did our first 100% sustainable aviation fuel test flight in 2012. We've been doing this for a while, and in 2023, Virgin Atlantic flew one of our aircraft on 100% sustainable aviation fuel and crossed the Atlantic on it. Most currently certification standards are up to a 50% blend. So we have certified all of our aircraft to fly on 50% SAF and 50% conventional jet fuel. And by 2030, every manufacturer in the world will have certified their aircraft up to 100% SAF.
What modifications need to be done to the aircraft and to the engines to allow that to happen?
Yeah, so we don't make engines. So we, it's not necessarily a process of modification. What we manufacture and what our biggest part in that is around fuel lines. And it's about certifying the safety of it as well. So it's about testing how much sustainable aviation fuel can you put through a fuel line before it has the same impact as, putting regular jet fuel through it. It's around more, the focus is on that than necessarily modifications. There aren't necessarily significant modifications that need to be made to the aircraft. And
taking a step back, could you just explain to the listeners then perhaps what are the current methods of producing SAF?
Yeah, so sustainable aviation fuel is really interesting because there are a lot of certification pathways and production pathways that are available. The one that is fully tested and is under operation is referred to as HEFA. So what that process is taking organic molecules either from things like used cooking oil or waste solids and waste agricultural residues. In very basic terms, you heat it up until it's what's referred to as gasified, and you take all of those carbon molecules that are in there, you add hydrogen in some form, and what spits out the other end is a liquid hydrocarbon. So that can then be processed into a kerosene replacement, which is what we do for Jet A1 fuel, or it could be turned into a biodiesel. And it's a very similar process. It's kind of that end step that's a little bit different, where you change, exactly what the hydrocarbon structure looks like and how heavy it might be. And that's where you get a different product out the end. So in very basic terms, you just heat something up until it turns into a gas, and then there are several products that come off it. We want hydrocarbons, and that means taking hydrogen or adding hydrogen to carbon molecules and getting a liquid fuel out of the end. It's a really incredible process, and I think one of the exciting things about it, and where there's a lot of opportunity for Australia in particular, is it works really well for things like oil seeds or for agricultural waste residues, where you've got things like waste that comes out of the end of sugarcane processing. There are also organisations in Australia like Wagner Sustainable Fuel that we're partnered with, where their process involves using your curbside waste. So they will it's so cool, because then you're kind of part of the process, right? But the technical phrase is municipal solid waste, right? So it's the thing that literally comes, that you put on your curb at the end of every week and can be collected and turned into biofuel. And so that's where there's a lot of opportunity kind of for different pathways. And that includes hydrogen in that process as well. Green hydrogen is either required as part of the additive process, where you get all these great carbon molecules that have come out of your gas and then you have to add hydrogen to turn it into a liquid, or in some instances, it's an energy-intensive process, and hydrogen has a place in that as well. So it's a really the thing that I think is really interesting about sustainable aviation fuels. It's every part of the sector, right? It's incredibly intersectional. It takes you're taking things out of landfill, or you're removing agricultural solid waste that is potentially a biodiversity factor, or you've got and then it requires renewable electrons anyway to get the process going. So it's incredible. And what's incredible about it is the product at the end is a 1-for-1 replacement to jet fuel. And there's very few processes like that in the world, where you're trying to substitute one thing for another, chemically or otherwise, and you get the same product at the end. It's a really incredible process.
Yes. Yeah. One of the questions that I get frequently is there going to be the volume of input source for SAF to allow for a whole industry, a huge industry to convert to zero carbon? So this is something that we do a lot. So Boeing has an interesting role in this, and I think it's not something that is traditionally thought about what an aircraft manufacturer might do. We purchase a certain amount of SAF as frequently as we can and as often as we can to use on our jets for testing and delivery. And that includes some of our military aircraft as well. But we don't purchase in volumes like an airline might. And so that's, so we're kind of limited in that sense. But what we can do, and what we do a lot of, is, supporting our customers in developing policy and working with governments to develop policy around sustainable aviation fuel. So we have done a lot of work with the CSIRO in Australia. We've been working with the CSIRO here for nearly 40 years. But what we have done with them in terms of sustainable aviation fuel is in 2023, we did a study with them around feedstock and roadmap and what will it take to get Australia to a sustainable aviation fuel industry. And in that study, we worked out exactly how much feedstock there is in the country and how much of our fuel demand it will meet by 2050 if we kept it here and processed it here as well. That's kind of the key part. There is a risk with any industry, any new industry, I guess, but one like this, where if we don't have the refinery capacity onshore and we don't have the appropriate infrastructure onshore, we will lose that feedstock. And the feedstock is what you make SAF out of. And you lose it to export, and it will go to another country and be turned into sustainable aviation fuel, and then we'll be buying it back. Yeah, I believe that's happening at the moment.
Which it can happen in some instances. And I think that's a significant risk for Australia. Yes. If we're talking about Australia and the Australian context, that's a risk. So we did that in 2023, and we did an update to it in 2024. It's referred to as the SAF State of Play report that we put out with the CSIRO. And there is enough feedstock here to meet a really significant portion of the sustainable aviation fuel demand by 2050. We've also done the same study in New Zealand, where New Zealand has enough feedstock to meet 30% of their jet fuel needs by 2050. Again, if they have the refinery capability and the right infrastructure in place and the right policy in place to support the development of a new industry there. So there's definitely potential. And I think that the other thing that Australia imports 99% of it's liquid fuels. I think that there's no argument about whether or not that's enough fuel. And, there are always supply chain risks and things like that. But the thing to also consider is that aviation is so incredibly international. So even though our airlines really are, might be based here, they're often picking up significant portions of fuel in other parts of the world and in transport hubs and depending on where they're placed. So even if we're doing our part as, Australia, there is also this need for an international effort to get, a truly global industry across the line.
Yes, yeah. We were talking before we started recording about the other challenges in terms of logistics and refueling times. Yeah. And obviously, with some of the airlines, I think some of the airlines have got a 25-minute kind of turnaround time. Yeah. Why does it take so much longer to refuel with SAF at the moment? And could that be changed over time to have the same process as current jet fuel?
Yeah, just to be clear, I think that's less of an issue. So what's the challenge with SAF? The few challenges with SAF at the moment are supply and infrastructure. But this is where SAF is really helpful in that it is the same amount of time to refuel on SAF. It's other technologies that take a really significant amount of time. So if an airport has, pipeline facilities or blending facilities or whatever they might require, SAF is completely one-to-one drop-in. It takes the same amount of time to refuel. It takes the same amount of usage, but it's everything as similar to Jet A1 as you can get in terms of process. The only thing that's different is that SAF can represent an 80% reduction on, carbon intensity over a life cycle of the product. Everything else is the same. So as long as, but the thing that might be challenging around infrastructure, for example, at airports is that some customers or some airlines might be ready to use 100% SAF while others are still on a blend. Or some airports, out of Singapore that we're expecting to see starting soon is there will be a 1% SAF blending mandate on flights coming in and out of Singapore. So that requires a certain amount of infrastructure. It's when you start talking about other technologies like electric and hydrogen that take a really significant amount of time and infrastructure, and that is where some of the challenges of why, we know that SAF works right now as opposed to other technologies. And when we talk about hydrogen and electric in particular, airports are going to have to play a massive role in electric and hydrogen. And that includes things like making sure there's enough space for batteries at airports and making sure there's, if it's a cryogenic hydrogen tank or whatever it might be. And that also includes things like space. You need to have enough space at an airport. And I always go back to the Sydney Airport example. Sydney Airport's a wonderful airport. It's my home airport, fly in and out of there all the time. There's just not much land there. So when you start adding in all this new charging infrastructure or whatever it might be, that really changes the operation of an airport. But when you're putting in a sustainable aviation fuel tank, that doesn't make a significant change to the airport operation, and an airline can just pick it up and drop it in. And that's what's part of what's so remarkable about SAF.
Yeah, as you touched upon electric, let's kind of move the conversation towards that way. So, what's Boeing's position on where electrification might be an option? Yeah,
I think electrification and hydrogen and any alternative technology absolutely has a place in the mix. And electrification is an interesting one because, especially in the Australian context, electrification we think is going to work better, or at least in the short to medium term will work better in markets where you've got a lot of short haul flights. And over 80% of the flights in Australia are over 1,500 kilometres, which means that they're actually almost all medium to long haul flights, which then the returns on electric start to diminish. It means that you're losing seats on an aircraft because you might have battery or other kind of new fuel tank cells or whatever it might be. And then again, the infrastructure challenge is going to be significant. And the other challenge with electric, again, in Australia is whether or not you have a green grid. And if you're charging your aircraft or fueling your aircraft without green electrons, what are you really doing to the carbon intensity of that flight, and how are you really fueling these things? And this is something that, our modelling tool, Cascade, our climate modelling tool, Cascade, you can figure it out and see for yourself that actually when you don't have a green grid in play and you're not putting green electrons into the infrastructure, then suddenly you're losing a lot of the decarbonisation value. There's absolutely a place for electric, and one of the cool things that we're working on is we have an organisation called WISC, which is a fully,
so cool.
It's so cool. I love talking about Whisk, and I'm absolutely going to be the first passenger on Whisk when it's here. I will come to Brisbane for it. But Whisk is a fully autonomous, fully electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, which is a way to say that it's not a helicopter, but it sort of looks like a helicopter. And it's a point-to-point service. So it's there'll be a network of vertiports across Brisbane by the 2032 Olympics, and you can get in a Whisk and go from one point to the other. And that's fully electric. That's a really good use case for electric because it's short flights. It's low. You've only got 4 passengers in the aircraft, and it's point-to-point. That's kind of where some of our focus on electric is at the moment, for sure. And that's not to say that there's not a place for electric in the future. It's just that the challenges, particularly in a market like Australia, are really significant. And that's where, SAF is a right now solution. Electric is a 2040 and beyond kind of solution for a long haul market.
Just to clarify, Whisk is fully autonomous? Fully autonomous.
So you will be on the aircraft with no pilot in the aircraft, which, again, is one of those things that you kind of have to bring people along the journey for, right? There is a pilot on the ground, and there will be staff at vertiports as needed and things like that. But that's part of what sets Whisk apart. So there's a lot of movement in the air taxi and the electric air taxi market, which is really exciting. But Whisk is the first one that plans to go fully autonomous, which is really cool. And I think that the fun thing about Whisk is that every time you talk about it, people have a million questions, which is great. But I was at a careers night recently where every student just wanted to know how to get into Whisk and how does it work and what can we do and is this the future of aviation? And in some contexts it is. And it's really exciting that Brisbane will be one of the first places in the world.
Yeah. I mean, if they can have those, I don't know if you've seen the light shows with all the drones, thousands of drones
so cool.
working together.
I think we could do a Whisk, I think I see where you're going with this, and we could do have a Whisk performance of some kind and get all the Whisk stuff in Brisbane for the
I was
Olympics.
coming at it more from the safety aspect.
Oh, no, never mind. Safety is important too. And I think actually that's a really good point. Whisk, the safety of Whisk and how Whisk will operate is totally new in the world, right? And when we talk about, again, back on this advanced technology idea, we have to work hand in glove with regulators, including CASA in Australia, which is the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, to develop new systems and new regulations for something like Whisk. And we'll have to often do the same for new technologies on an aircraft, no matter what we're talking about. And the Whisk use case is a really interesting one where it's, what might have traditionally been unregulated airspace, and suddenly you've got all these Whisks flying around, and how do you regulate for something like that? And how do you build safety systems with communities? And also, how do you build kind of these sustainability concepts into it with communities from the beginning? Electric is one thing, but then there's also, there's ideas around noise and how does that impact communities? And that's something that every time we implement something new, we have to think about really carefully. Whisk is just a really fun example of how that all works.
Yes, yep. You touched upon the tool Cascade.
Yeah.
Could you explain to the listeners in a bit more detail what that is? Is that in the public forum?
Absolutely public. Anyone can access it. Cascade.boeing.com. It's one of those things that's worth taking your laptop out for, and rather than your phone. It still looks good on your phone, but absolutely, it's worth taking the laptop out for and playing with for a while. So Cascade launched a little while ago, and we've just launched 2.0 this past year, and it is a fully open source modelling tool. We built it in partnership with NASA, Cambridge, MIT, and a raft of others, where we have taken flight data from a very significant time back, where you can effectively figure out how to decarbonize your fleet, and you can, fully customize it and personalize it for very specific requirements. So earlier I mentioned that, Australia has this difficult in some terms long haul market where all of our flights are really long because it takes a while to get anywhere. And you can put that into Cascade and it will tell you exactly what it takes to get your fleet down to net zero. And that includes things like, what if I had this much sustainable aviation fuel at this price? And then you can build in things like electric. And when we look at, is your grid green or is it still brown? And what about hydrogen? And if your hydrogen is grey or green or blue, or where does it come from? You can build all of that into your Cascade model. And suddenly it spits out this thing where it tells you how long, how much investment it will take, and what kinds of aircraft or what kinds of fleet investments it will take you to get to net zero. And that includes all the energy ones. It's also something that we update pretty frequently, and you can go in and dive behind all of the data points as well. It's something we're really proud of, and it's It's completely free to use. Anyone can use it. But we also very genuinely and earnestly use it with policymakers and decision makers and airlines and investors and whoever needs to see the data. This is a really easy way to visualize it and to understand what it actually takes to get to net zero in the aviation space.
What about materials? What materials is Boeing considering for the new aeroplanes?
So we've started incorporating a lot of carbon fiber into our airplanes, and again, that's something that we do in Melbourne. But that kind of carbon composite in some aircraft, and depending on the size and the use case for it, carbon fibers and composites are the way to go. In some, it's actually still aluminium and other things. So that part of it is really cool. And I think, again, we're throwing everything we can at this challenge, right? So
recyclable materials.
Yeah. So that includes things like, so when you think about a plane, often the big deal of it is like the outside, and the engines obviously are pretty significant, but there's also a lot of room to play in cabins and interiors. And where we can, we take part in a lot of end-of-life recycling programs. And it's something that our customers are demanding from us too. That's what, passengers who are flying want to see, and it's what airline customers want. And so there are all sorts of fun things that we can do in interiors that we're currently testing as well. And they make a really significant difference. And my favorite example of this is our carpets. We're developing there's carpet on every aircraft in the world, and everything you put in the aircraft suddenly makes it heavier, which means that there's fuel use attached to it, because the more weight you're putting on the aircraft, the more fuel you're using. And once you make that connection, you start to realize that, everything that you do on the aircraft counts. So if we can recycle a certain amount of water to stop putting more water on the aircraft when you're loading, that's, 50 kilos of water saved. That equates to, a certain amount of fuel savings. And carpet, we're currently testing a carpet that is made out of recycled fibers that, again, you can actually blend it. So you can blend it with traditional nylon all the way through to, recycled fibers. And it can save 23 kilos of weight on a 737 or up to 55 kilos on a 787 just in carpet. And then suddenly that translates to a certain number of gallons or litres of fuel saved. And that's a certain number of CO2 that you just are suddenly not putting into the atmosphere. And you have the added benefit of you've used recycled fibers. So you're taking something out of kind of the waste loop and really leaning into that circularity idea where we can for, testing the limits of what's possible. And I think, and again, this is a certification issue where suddenly now we're fire testing carpet in our labs in partnership with the Federal Aviation Authority. And we do all sorts of cool things. And I think that, every little piece counts. And that is where, things like water savings and carpets and blinds on aircraft and storage bins and things made out of recycled material suddenly make a significant contribution.
Yeah, all those 1%ers that accumulate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, it reminds me of parallels to the GB Olympic cycling team. Going from the worst in the world and all those 1%ers, and looked at how they cyclists, what kind of pillows they had at night, what kind of seats that they had, and over time, all those 1%ers, and you kind of end up being world champions at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it suddenly starts to make you think about your own habits, and I don't really want to go down that path too carefully.
Anyway, back on track. What do you see as the kind of biggest barriers, and what are the biggest opportunities?
Yeah, I think the biggest opportunity in the Australian context, and additionally in the New Zealand context, actually, is sustainable aviation fuel. And again, it's part of this global ecosystem, but what Australia has and what Australia doesn't have really suits sustainable aviation fuel. We have this wealth of feedstock. We've got skilled workforces. We've done the analysis with the CSIRO. We know how many thousands of jobs this can contribute, and, fuel security. And, just last month, we published a study with Cyan Ventures doing this study in New Zealand as well. And the development of a sustainable aviation fuel industry in New Zealand will, by 2050, add 5,700 jobs into the New Zealand economy and 1.3 billion New Zealand dollars back into their GDP,
wow,
which is an incredible volume when you're considering how much they can actually produce because of, again, limitations on economies. That's how it works. But it's an incredible volume of fuel that can be produced, and it's incredible value that goes back into in economies and communities. And sustainable aviation fuel, again, is a right now solution. We have all the pieces in place. What some of the barriers are a little bit trickier to define. And I think that there is a role that governments can play in terms of supportive policy. And we've seen examples around how that might work in other parts of the world, where you look at Singapore and there's a levy that's been introduced to, try and incorporate SAF blending mandates into fuel, and that will start at 1% and ramp up, and in Europe as well. But when we look at things that come out of the United States, and particularly in states like Washington, where you've got blending tax credits and production tax credits that you suddenly can stack. So you might have like a national incentive and then a state-based incentive that become completely stackable, and you start to bring down that the green premium that's associated with sustainable aviation fuel production. So there are a lot of paths that can be taken, and we're reasonably policy agnostic. We don't advocate for one policy or another in a particular context, but there are certain recommendations we might make, which include that, a policy should be stackable. If a federal government has a policy, it should work in tandem with a state-based policy. And again, going back to how international and how intersectional aviation is, global harmonization is also something that we look towards, and a lot of our customers do. If a customer is picking up fuel in Sydney and LAX and Heathrow, it's helpful for them to have similar policies and pricing mechanisms around the world. So I think that's the right now challenge. And then, looking towards things like hydrogen and electric, there is so much opportunity in both of those things. And again, there are challenges around infrastructure, but where we can play like a really significant role is around the research and technology. And we've got, a really thorough and proven track record on some of these things. We've been flying aircraft on hydrogen since 2008. We've flown, passenger vehicles, and we've flown drones on liquid hydrogen, and these new proton exchange membranes and all sorts of things that we've been doing for more than 10 years at this point. So we know what the opportunities are. It's about where we place our resources and where we put our time and effort into, developing these new markets and developing up these new technologies for use.
Is there anything else that we've not spoken about? It's been so broad, the conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's truly kind of an endless sort of thing, which is always exciting. And there's a lot to talk about in this space. I think that one of the things that I think about a lot is that it sometimes seems like aviation moves quite slowly. And, I've spent a lot of time talking about certification processes and how, it takes a lot of work to make something safe and to make it fly and make it reliable. And I think that it's not really that slow. When you look at it, it might feel like this huge monumental challenge. And the thing to remember is that we're in this moment right now. We are in this moment where we have an opportunity, and it's really critical that, countries like Australia and New Zealand don't miss that opportunity for so many reasons. Things are moving incredibly quickly. There is so much, hope in decarbonisation that's cropping up everywhere, not just in, experiments that we run or things that we do, but, new companies and new organisations cropping up all the time that are doing really incredible things that we can continue to partner with. And there's so much activity happening. And I think that it's just really critical that everyone kind of seizes the opportunity while it's here. And that will only help us get to, net zero by 2050 sooner.
Yeah, awesome. And we'll get a lot of links in the show notes to Cascade, to Whisk, and your LinkedIn page and Boeing's website. Any other messages that you want to get across to the listeners?
Yeah, I think, look, now is the time, and now is the time to make the biggest impact in what we can do, and it's just a really exciting space to be in, and I'm very grateful to be part of such a truly like cross-functional, cross-intersectional, international team that feels like we're, solving one of the world's biggest challenges, and it's truly one of the hardest sectors to abate, but we've made so much headway, and I'm excited to see where things go.
Thanks so much, Hannah.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate the depth of the discussion, and I'm overwhelmed at the depth of knowledge that you've got. I'm sure the listeners will love it. So
and there's plenty more to research. So please reach out. Please read all the links. I always think our Instagram is really cool, the Boeing Instagram, because it's always like fun, flight testing and demonstrations and things that are being shown on there. But yeah, there's a whole world out there, and I'm excited for people to come find us.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of Exploring Clean Energy. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. I'm keen to continue to bring you the best experts and most interesting projects. So if you have an exciting story to share, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or email. I'm Andy Marsland, and hopefully see you next time.